Yeah, okay, fantastic. Well, welcome back, everyone. Thanks for coming back in after lunch. So we're on time in a remarkable fashion. So hopefully I can stick to that. My name is Freddie Carver. I'm the director of the Humanitarian Policy Group here at ODI Global. And yeah, it's a real pleasure to be running this session this afternoon. We've got a fantastic set of speakers. And I think after what was such a, stimulating and interesting morning, and the sort of the shape of the day, the idea of this panel and the kind of flow is really, I think this morning was about, well, hearing from experience, but really about diagnosing the problem. Really about being clear around how does this problem play out in a variety of different contexts, and how do we need to start thinking differently around financing service delivery in fragile states, and some of the ways that these issues have been experienced by communities, by states, by international organizations as well. And I think the idea of this afternoon is we go from that diagnosis to, okay, what do we do about it? We also know that these problems are not new. We've been talking about them in one form or another for decades. But we do have a lot of good experience. We're going to hear from a set of people in the next panel who are really going to help us hone in on this question of capacity. Often, we all know this, the international system, whether in humanitarian or development context, uses this excuse of capacity as a way of avoiding working differently. So the question we really want to dig into is, how do we build capacities, or how are we working with existing capacities? How are we supporting existing capacities in different contexts? Where is there good practice? And we want to look not just at the state, but we also want to look at non-state actors. So we're going to start by hearing from a couple of speakers talking about the role of mutual aid networks, very much building on the session we had, the presentation we had from Eva before lunch, and then talking about the private sector. And then we'll turn back to the state and how we're working with states in different ways, in different contexts. So hopefully we have a very practical solutions kind of focused discussion in this after lunch session before we then go on to the rest of the day. So that's the plan. And I'm very, very happy to be turning over to Juliet to start. Juliet is the director of ALNAP, the Active Learning Network for Accountability and Performance in Humanitarian Action, hosted here at ODI Global. So Juliet, drawing on your expertise, are there viable alternatives, or what are the viable alternatives to the current default routing of aid finances through UN and INGO intermediaries in contexts, particularly in contexts where governments are absent or politically estranged? We had this conversation this morning about questions of legitimacy and issues of politicization. And if so, to what extent do you see these alternatives being given priority in current discussions about the future of the humanitarian system? Over to you.
Great, thank you very much, and very nice to be here. We published a report last year, ALNAP, looking at local intermediary models. And our overall finding was, yes, there are lots of viable alternatives, well-established, well-functioning, and well-evidenced alternatives. We actually categorized local intermediaries into 4 categories. The first is a model of single local intermediary. And you'll find all the examples in the report, but this is where you have an entity who works as an intermediary to disperse funding, wherever that funding comes from, to local grassroots. And they may do that in a variety of ways through more formalized or less formalized mechanisms, allowing for accessibility and nuance according to local contexts. There's also a second model around networks of local intermediaries. So we use a few examples, one from Myanmar, the Lian network, which is 14 organizations who collectively work as a network of intermediaries, which increases reach and connectivity. There's also networks of mutual aid efforts, like the emergency response rooms in Sudan is probably the highest profile example at the moment, but there are others. And then also multi-country LNA networked pooled funds like the Near Change Fund, for example. So within the report, we look at these 4 different models and give examples of them. I suppose what we would say is that the range of viable alternatives exists, as does the evidence to support their ability to deliver. But that's not really the problem. The problem that we're finding really is about how the traditional sector and traditional funders can engage with and support those existing initiatives. and also whether they're willing to do so. And a little bit the question that, I was just asked is, are there viable alternatives? Which is kind of the problem. It's assuming that there is a right approach and that there's a single approach that could be the solution. And what's increasingly coming out from the humanitarian sector is these discussions around ecosystems approaches, where we might want a whole ecology of funding instruments that can be mapped against ranges of ecosystems of potential delivery mechanisms. But that doesn't fit with our traditional funding mechanisms or our traditional donor approaches. And really what the question that we're looking at is, and many others as well, is how can traditional funding mechanisms better engage in ways that support the development of strong ecosystems with multiple funding mechanisms, rather than this kind of pressure to find a good mechanism, invest in it, and somehow pressure or shape it into something that fits with our system. This issue of kind of ecosystems of mechanisms and funding modalities is really important in the kind of change moment within the sector, because there is quite, the sector tends to move towards centralized systems in order for efficiency and accountability and various other things. But looking at a kind of systems model, these centralized systems have real risks with them. One is that they compromise the diversity of actors or the ability of wide ranges of actors to engage, but also they are slow to evolve. So you end up with a more rigid, less adaptive system that's consolidated around fewer humanitarian actors. And the challenge for the humanitarian system really at the moment, one of them, is how to address that. And within that, there are kind of two big unknowns. One is around the nature of the interaction of these mechanisms with the traditional sector, and the other is on the willingness or the ability of traditional funders to actually be able to change. One of the things, the NEAR Network launched a paper yesterday on ecosystems, which is really good and well worth a read, or watch back on the launch if you haven't already. And one of the things that they highlight in their paper is also this pressure that becomes exerted or can become exerted on well-functioning mechanisms to more closely conform to the expectations of the formal sector. So, and that really can undermine the relational, adaptive and community-embedded ways of working that make them effective. Within LNAP, we've got a current research project looking at mutual aid approaches, which is really looking at the question of how the traditional funding modalities can engage with mutual aid initiatives in a way that doesn't squash what's so valuable about them. And this always comes back to the question of scale, of course, because one of the things that the traditional sector is built for and is very proud of being able to deliver on is scale. And it's one of those, I suppose, conceited criticisms of local actors and localization is that they can't scale in the same way. And certainly there's a pressure or expectation on scaling intermediary models in that, the essence of what makes them so valuable may not be scalable, which is why the ecosystems approach then becomes more interesting. If you are looking to scale an ecosystem rather than scale an individual mechanism, then it doesn't become so much of an issue if we can work out how to scale ecosystems. Certainly, I mean, if you look at the experience of the ERRs at the moment, who are doing very brilliant work and are scaling their funding very successfully, it will be very interesting learning to see coming out of the ERRs the extent to which they are able to preserve and protect the essence of their mutual aid identity whilst being able to manage and engage with the traditional funding sector. Also within this, I just wanted to give also a quick shout out to international intermediaries. So they get a bit of a tough rap at the moment. And certainly we would say that there's areas of reform that are needed, particularly around, how incentives are structured. But they have, within an ecosystem approach, they also have a really important and valuable place if they are able to reform themselves more around equitable partnerships, and how they provide, what sort of support they provide and how they provide it, And really, thinking about everyone having their place, so long as it's done in balance, and also in a way that has an element of coherence. And I think that's one of the other challenges looking towards a more ecosystem approach is what level of coherence or coordination do you need, and what might that look like in a way that enables and supports diversity. So just a couple of thoughts to finish with. One is, we need to acknowledge, value, and build on what's already there. So looking at and recognizing and valuing the current mechanisms, which look very different from each other, and finding ways to support those is absolutely essential. The other is that we do have knowledge gaps. We don't really know what an ecosystem or set of ecosystems would look like, or how it would function, or how we might engage with it. Or this question of, how to support coherence and a level of coordination in that sort of environment. And the other is really around, how to support funding instruments that invest, we would say equitably and collectively. So in a coordinated fashion, but in a way that recognizes and supports a multiplicity of mechanisms, rather than focusing on the one or two that are proven to work, but support for which may then come at the exclusion of a richer ecosystem.
Thank you very much. And well within time, which is much appreciated. No, I think there's a huge amount of resonance with the discussions this morning, particularly around this question of building on what's already there. And we talked a lot this morning about parallel systems and the dangers and risks that are associated with them. And this question of how we embed and how we support systems that already exist is key. And I think that's one of the key things I take from what you said, is this issue of diversity and complexity. And systems within any context, within any kind of location, wherever we're talking about, are always going to be multiple and complex. So the question is, how do we ensure that the instruments that we bring into these environments don't work against or damage that diversity and flexibility, which I think is a really critical point. So, and I think that brings us on nicely then to the role of the private sector. And I think I've had so many conversations over the years where someone says, oh, what about the private sector? And the next person always says, but what do you mean by the private sector? There are so many private sectors, and we know this is true, from small businesses to large multinational corporations and everything in between and aside. But we're delighted to have Abed Alaeddin, the team lead of the Syria Education Programme from Chemonics, who's going to talk to us about how his project has really worked with the private sector around education delivery in Syria. So over to you, Abed.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you for giving this opportunity to speak about Chemonics project, and Chemonics as a private company also working in education in Northwest Syria. And I will start by setting the scene for the Chemonics Syria Education Project. Just to set the scene for you, the project started in 2018, focused mainly on Northwest Syria. So Northwest Syria was the part of Syria that was only under opposition-held area, so working outside regime-held areas at that time. So what does that mean for us? That we were working in a very tired humanitarian situation in Northwest Syria, outside of regime control, so outside of state control. There were civilian-led education directorate that were operating in that area. And the scale of non-supported schools and out of government support school was, at least at the primary level, over 1,000 schools that were not supported at all. And at that stage, our project stepped in to support approximately 50% of the primary schools in Northwest Syria. So just to give you a kind of scale of the work that we're talking about, over the years, we have supported around 800,000 children, supported over like 10,000 teachers over the years with paying salaries, and reflecting on the Ministry of Education in Palestine this morning, which was also about financing the system. It's not only about building the capacity, etc. So just like setting the scene so you can understand exactly what the project is built on. But also I would like to start with like what the myth is about private sector engagement. So there is this kind of misconception about that profit could be the main driver for any private sector in comparison to non-profit, for example. So our project, for example, was working with non-profit basis in terms of the fee, the admin fee in comparison, for example, with admin fee that could be taken by NGOs or INGOs or UN agencies is very limited in comparison. And this is usually negotiated with FCDO when signing the contract. So this is like the first part of like this kind of misconception that sometimes people think that private sector, so profit would be the main driver, for example. The other misconception is about the perception of being donor-driven in general, which is in reality exactly the opposite, because the flexibility, and I will be coming into more about the unique strength of private sector in conflict settings, is exactly the distinguish between what you have a contract with the donor, and then but also you have agreements with implementers on the ground. Sometimes these implementers could be state authorities or could be NGOs or INGOs. So in general, I will be mentioning quickly 6 points that could be considered as a strengths for private sector in conflict settings. The first one is usually they are system focused. The implementation is system focused. So focus mainly on supporting the capacity to support public system functions. So for example, I've mentioned the example of the Syria Education Project, supporting payroll so it's not only about providing stipends to teachers who were not receiving any fund or from the state or from the government. So it's about supporting the payroll, supporting the data, supporting procurement processes, even conducting an early grade reading assessment, for example. So supporting system and data collection tools that could be beneficial on the long run, rather than parallel service delivery. So with no actual criticism of what others are doing, but I think in a way or another, we have witnessed a lot of support that sometimes like will be a single fund that goes only to one school, probably would cost around 300,000. Everything is delivered to the school, while probably a nearby school don't have heating system for the children. So one school is like 5-star schools, and the next school is actually they don't have heaters at their classes. And also sometimes like one-off delivery of service, like delivering 100,000 bags, like bags for schools, for example, not regardless of these were needed or not, just because these were. So the fact that this is system focused usually. The second point is about the clear accountability and performance management, specifically in terms of having private sector having a contract-based delivery. This creates an output and outcome level focus, specifically tied to KPIs, key performance indicators, focus on learning, which is actually valuable specifically in politically complex and environment with very limited tolerance to failure and with a very little risk appetite in a context like Syria, for example. And also for usually it's a long-term employment for staff within the project for the life of the project. The third point is about operational adaptability, and specifically in a very rapid changing context. So I would usually private sector implementers can adjust delivery modules really quickly, staffing and preparedness as well. A quick example from the Syria Education Project was the ability to move. When we started the project in 2018, part of Syria in the south was liberated and under opposition held area. However, the Assad regime at that time were able to take this part again. We were able to quickly adapt and focus on Northwest Syria, while at the same time, there have been some projects that totally closed without even they just closed their projects and did not do any kind of adaptation and quick adaptation. Another example is, for example, after the liberation of Syria and the fall of Assad regime, we were able to shift really quickly from focusing in only Northwest Syria delivery basis of supporting schools to focus more on providing technical assistance to the Ministry of Education in Damascus, which is now a recognized body, a ministry that we could work with and actually achieve something on a national and system level. Also, in terms of risk absorption and fiduciary buffering on behalf of donors, private sector play a very good role in terms of actually being having a bigger appetite for risk, for example, in comparison to donors. And that's why they take the risk, and specifically reputational risk on behalf of donors, which is actually enable the engagement with domestic, for example, enabling the engagement with the education directorate in Northwest Syria at that time was really challenging because they were part of recognized by the called a Syrian interim government, but at the same time, we knew that in Northwest Syria, there was a Salvation government that was part of a proscribed group at that time. And we were not and the managing the risk around all of this is really easier with the private sector because they have the adaptability to work around it and find alternative ways in terms of protecting also the reputational protecting the reputation of donors and the fund in general. I will quickly, one last point is the cross-sectoral integration between education, protection, and for example, education, protection, and health sometimes can be all merged together with private sector. For example, referral system under our project, we were able to have referral system to other services provided in the area. Speaking of limitation of course, we have covered the strength side of it, but also there are some limitation. And mainly, for example, there was uneven integration within multilateral frameworks. Specifically, we have struggled even I've mentioned the size of the project, supporting even 50% of the Northwest Syria schools. At that time, we were not allowed to be part of the UN education cluster, for example. Now we're part of the education sector after probably 6 or 7 years of engagement and working in Northwest Syria. So this is kind of a limitation, for example. And also there is a time-bound engagement. In the end, contracts have a limit in terms of can be affected with fund level and have a limit in terms of time, of course. And just with the last 10 seconds to conclude with one statement in the end, the private sector is effective in protracted crisis when used not as a substitute for the state, but as a transitional mechanism. So this is really important. And probably this is why I asked my colleagues in the previous session, I asked Karim and Dr. Olia as well in terms of sustainability, because for me, this is really good in terms of huge shift and transition quickly to work with the state level, for example, working with the ministry could help sustainability and could support transitional mechanism. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Abed. And I think you picked up on a couple of points there that I'll just bring out. One is this very strong emphasis on system strengthening, which I think is core to everything we're talking about, and taking that systems thinking approach and moving away from project implementation. And then the second point that I'm really glad you raised is this issue of risk. And I think we all know that that is often the elephant in the room in these conversations which we've been having for so many years around how to embed within local systems rather than set up parallel structures. We know that fundamentally the reason why donors continue to set up parallel systems is because their risk appetite remains low. And sadly, I fear that it is going only in one direction and not in a positive way. So finding ways through intermediaries, through different partners to manage that risk in a more constructive way that gets us closer to where we need to be, I think is critical. So I thought we would to break things up a bit, and maybe just have 10 minutes now for a first set of questions or comments, reflections on what you've heard so far, and then we'll turn to the other two speakers. So I want to open it up. I see one question here. If we can get a microphone. Thank you.
Thank you. I introduced myself. I'm Lara, and I'm with the Resource Alliance. My question is for Juliet. You talked about this idea of having different funding mechanisms to support an ecosystem of various actors. And you mentioned, okay, yeah, we'd need to think about how coordination in a context like that would look. And I just wanted to hone in a little bit on that question, because of course, coordination is something, sorry, I'm out of breath. Coordination is something that's been, focused on for so long as really key for efficient response and effective response. And so what are some of the thoughts that you have on what coordination could look like if you're going to have multiple intermediaries with different funding mechanisms supporting different ecosystems?
Good question. Maybe we'll take a couple more. One here and then one here. Okay, we'll take those three.
So thank you very much. So my question to Abdelkader, I think linking, with the question at the beginning with the comment Freddie at the beginning mentioned about what is private sector, who are private sector, and who are the actors in this private sector. And I'm thinking about all these, different type of private sector and linking that with the previous session about the regularity, how this could be in a context of fragile settings, protracted conflict. The private sector could be regulated. It could be, a sort of, whether it will be under the, with a link with the government, or will be a sort of a body that could have an influence. So my question about the regulations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Then we had one here. Sneaking in. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. My name is Saba, and I am a student at UCL. And my question is for you, Abdelkader. You mentioned operational adaptability within the private sector. My question is, what are key strategies used by the private sector to avoid or to increase risk absorption in comparison with other, non-governmental organizations or governmental organizations? What sets the private sector apart from those organizations in that?
Okay, we'll take two more and then we'll.
Again, it's Abdul Karim. When we think about private sector in complex settings, I think there are some caveats because most complex settings or fragile countries, they do not have strong regulatory frameworks to govern and regulate a private sector when it comes to quality and social protection. And how to go about this, and whether we need to maybe think of other actors, for example, non-for-profit companies or social enterprises. I think they might do sometimes a better job without having the risk that comes with private sector.
Fantastic. And then Olya.
Thank you so much, Olya, research fellow at ODI. Question to Juliet. It sounds really idealistic, right? Great funding ecosystems, but as a question came here, we've been talking about the same idea since the Great Bargain. And the truth is, the World Bank or GPE staff, they oftentimes don't have the capacity on their end to do kind of ecosystem financing. In education sector, they usually come in and, okay, there's UNICEF, we trust them, here's a bulk of funding. And so I think the question is, from your research, are there more instances of where, for example, in Bangladesh, BROC, which is a large NGO working in Cox's Bazar, they're capable to do that intermediary role. Is there space for UNICEF and stepping back a little bit? Because as much as we would like to see an ecosystem funding with the cuts in staff on the bilateral donors and so forth, I just don't see that there will be capacity to do that sort of engagement. Thank you.
Capacity strengthening for bilateral donors. That is maybe an increasingly critical area. Okay, we had a couple of questions for you there, Juliet, and then a couple for you. So let's take those, and then we'll have the second half, and anyone who wasn't able to ask can come in at the end. But over to you, Juliet.
Okay, cool. So there was something about funding mechanisms. I just saw Sophia walked in. So I just wanted to flag a piece of work that Sophia and Lydia Poole did for DCA on the ecology of funding instruments with the, like there's a kind of checklist tool and stuff like that. So I think you were interested in the kind of like range of funding instruments and how you might choose or define or, you know, think about. So I've definitely chatted to Sophia. Then one on coordination. So, and I mean, this is one that I definitely highlight as an area for further research and investigation, I think, unless other people in the room have the answer. I mean, I was talking to one of my cousins at a wedding recently, and he works for a rum, so an international rum like company, and he works in the Caribbean, obviously, and they have this whole preparedness plan around reinstating power supply, rubble clearance, all this sort of stuff, getting everybody back into work, and you know, everything. And I'm like, you do realize that's what I work on? And he was like, seriously, you do food and blankets? It's like, oh my god. You know, so it was really interesting because, you know, how do you coordinate, I mean, whole sections of the kind of response capacity that are invisible to each other, you know, and that don't, you know, all those sorts of questions, which I think is interesting. But there's a few things, I haven't found the answer yet anywhere, but there are a few principles that do keep coming out. Coordination, there needs to be space for networking and coordination, is for sure. It should build on what's already there. It should invest in, you know, locally rooted, if there's functioning government or alternative mechanisms, all those sorts of things. But I think it's an area for further research, really, to work out and understand what might be possible. And then the question on local intermediaries, I've just forgotten it.
The question was on what are the realistic, are there kind of realistic models out there, particularly given some of the trends around capacity within the funding institutions?
Okay, so yes, I mean, my opinion, not LNAP's, I mean, it looks like the future is pooled because the system can only manage so many bilateral funding relationships. The question is there are there pooled mechanisms that further invest in and support greater diversity of actors rather than those that seek to consolidate around fewer actors? And can pooled funds actually positively support an ecosystem approach rather than decorating themselves as an ecosystem approach? If you see what I mean.
That's a good challenge. Okay, over to you, Abed, please.
Yeah, thank you. Sir, first of all, thank you, Dr. Fayad, for this question. Actually, this has been the story of my life for the last 10 years. Every time I'm asked what I do for a living or which company I work for, I end up saying that I work for charity. So it's just like sometimes really hard to explain a development company and how they operate, for example. So if I'm talking from an implementer point of view, as a like having a private company, for example, working with a private company that implements projects funded by donors, could be FCDO or other donors as well. So these are actually, like, in terms of regulation, follows different regulations. So they follow the regulation within the country that they're, like right now, I work with Chemonics UK, we follow Chemonics UK, we follow the UK law and regulation in the UK. We follow the regulation as per the contracts that we have with FCDO, so every single project. And also we follow the regulation that are within country when we do registration inside Syria, for example, or when we were working from Turkey, we follow the regulation in Turkey. So it's multiple regulation and mainly tied with the contract itself. Specifically in fragile setting, having these kind of protection actually is really good in terms of for implementers, because we operate under different ways. And this is probably also overlap with Dr. Karim's question about like having a strong regulation framework, but also in terms of the quality. So we're tightened, as you know, with like KPIs, with outputs and outcomes that we are supposed to achieve. We are limited in time. So this is a project implemented by Chemonics. It means solely focus on this. The good thing about it, and I will be turning to your question before coming to your question, Saba, because they are connected somehow, is actually you mentioned about non-profit. So we were lucky to also work with Action for Humanity, the organization that Karim also is a country director for. So part of our ability to actually work through non-profit, it means that we have that flexibility as well. So we sub-grant or we grant for non-profit, like Action for Humanity, like other organizations within Syria or within any different context. In our specific project, we have the flexibility, which also bring the ability to adapt really quickly. So we can contract with NGOs, we can contract with research companies, we can contract with third-party monitoring. We have that flexibility that allows us to deliver, but also at the same time, back to your point, Saba, in terms of operational adaptability. This is an example of operational adaptability. We can adapt our partnership. We can move quickly. We spoke about risk absorption, for example. At one point within the project, we were working directly with the Education Directorate in Northwest Syria. But at some point, because of, at that time, a proscribed group intervention, we had to stop working directly with them. And we have to channel funds through a direct way. And we started to work with NGOs to deliver these stipends while we do the monitoring. So we were able, like, we're talking about, in January, we're paying this way, in February, we're paying. And like, we did not stop the fund for teachers. And this is a good example of a quick adaptability. Also, in your presentation, Karim, you spoke about the earthquake support. You flagged the point that, for example, 10 days it took for, like, for example, for trucks to enter from Turkey to Syria, because also Turkey was affected at that time. But a quick adaptability, I remember, and also I'm joined by one of our colleagues on the project, the second day of the earthquake, while we were also displaced, we were planning for how we want to adapt and how we want to implement activities and respond really quickly. From day 3, we were able to change our work plan and work quickly. Again, I'm not saying this as a kind of criticism. Of course, like, in the end, all of these are like, can work together. NGOs, INGOs, UN system, and contractors, if we want to say it in this way. Projects implemented that have specific objectives can all work together to achieve more sustainable approach.
Wonderful, thank you very much. And I'm going to flag a question that's come in online that maybe we can kind of come back to at the end. And it's a good challenge, I think, from Jerry McHugh, who says there is an inherent assumption in this conversation that the existing intermediaries are viable and that they should play a role going forward, rather than going directly to primarily decentralized models, such as mutual aid groups. Grateful for the panel's perspectives on the viability of existing intermediaries going forward. So we can come back to that at the end. But I want to turn to now where the conversation today started, I think particularly the kind of some of the experiences we were hearing from Palestine this morning. And our next speaker will reflect on how aid can be coordinated to strengthen government oversight of and engagement with external interventions, drawing on his extensive experience managing pool funds across a wide range of conflict-affected settings. Rohan Degelpierre, apologies, is the basic education lead at Agence France de Développement, or AFD. He's an economist by training, specialized in development and education, and over the last 20 years has contributed to the design and implementation of education programs across a dozen countries in Africa and the Middle East. So Rohan, can you please share successful examples of where pool funding mechanisms have really enabled greater alignment with priorities of governing authorities? Thanks.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I'm very happy to be here. I'm working for the French Agency of Development, which is a bank, development bank, doing loan and grant. I'm an economist. I did my PhD something like 15 years ago on education efficiency, what we're discussing together. And since now I'm working for a few operation projects. And right now I'm task team leader on three countries, which are Lebanon, DRC, and Niger. So I will just try to discuss a little bit in a research perspective from some research we have going on these topics and some from operational perspective. First of all, I would like to say that it's an odd question, and most of the discussion we have since this morning, we could have it like 20 years ago, and because 20 years ago we had this Paris Declaration on Aid Efficiency, and it was all the topics we are discussing together. So, and one of the most powerful principle was aid is more transformative when it strengthens institution rather than substitute for them. And it's something very important, even in protracted crisis countries. In this context, aid is not temporary for sure. It shapes systems and over a long period of time. And the way aid is delivered deeply influences incentives, procedure, and institutional trajectories. So I will focus my presentation on one point, which is alignment. Well, we are all saying the same thing, but I will give just like few numbers and just some numbers and one example. If we examine trends over the past 2 decades, the picture is very clear. Most education aid, I mean total aid to education, is still delivered through standalone projects, even after the Declaration of Paris. The use of national public financial management systems has not significantly expanded, and budget support has even declined among several major donors. In practice, this leads to high fragmentation, even in countries without any crisis. I mean, it's for all the developing countries. We have the same situation. In the majority of low-income countries, we have to manage more than 25 implementing agencies in education. And the average size of aid transaction has decreased substantially since 20 years. That's the situation we have right now, and it's a systemic efficiency problem. And it probably will be even worse in next years. Since the traditional aid is decreasing, we have many other like private operators, philanthropy coming. So the situation could be even worse in the next few years. One case, I would like to take just 1 minute on DRC. Actually, in DRC, the alignment is not even attempt, actually. We have plenty of projects, plenty of project units, multiple parallel project implementation, and financial management is largely externalized. The consequence is very important. I mean, in DRC right now, nobody knows who do what where, actually. In the local education group, but the Ministry of Education don't know who do what where, actually. That's the situation right now. And if you work in DRC, it's a major issue. And in a way, we are part of the problem, for sure. Part of the solution, I really believe it, because we are doing a lot of very good things in this country. But this alignment issue is huge in DRC right now. And if I take another situation, it's Lebanon. On education in Lebanon, we have the TREF, the Transition and Resilience Education Fund. If I take like 1 minute on Lebanon, following fiscal collapse and large-scale integration of Syrian refugees, donors choose to finance education within the public systems, which is good, actually. The TREF was established as a pool mechanism to finance teacher salaries and co-operating costs, which was very important at this time. And right now, it's still, we are funding this TREF with all the partners you can see at the bottom of the slide. Institutional onshoring was maintained. However, key financial management and operational function were externalized to UNICEF due to fiduciary risk. This results in partial alignment. I mean, it's in a way, it's an externalized alignment. It's UNICEF who do the job. The public system was preserved, but some core management functions were substituted. And right now, the challenge we have, since we are still funding this TREF, it's to define a credible and gradual transition back toward fuller use of national system. We want to use the national system within the Lebanon Ministry of Education, but it's difficult. So Lebanon shows that pooling is necessary but not sufficient. If I just take 1 minute on a little bit what Olia said, so there's like two extremes between fragmentation and fungibility. On one end, we have project-based aid who generate fragmentation. But on the other one, we have traditional budget support, which can be politically sensitive and difficult to sustain. The main issue on budget support is fungibility. When we give money to the government, we are not so sure that at the end it will go to education. And it's a part of the discussion we have with Ministry of Education, even if Ministry of Finance prefer budget for support for sure. So we worked since few years on a middle way, and a different one of Olia actually, which is Aligned Pool Fund. Aligned Pool Fund brings together several donors to support one national education plan under one system with one set of rules. In practice, it starts from a government-led sector plan. Partners then pool their resources into a single fund that is integrated into the national budget. This means that the funds are recorded in the finance law, and it's very important, executed through national procurement and accounting system, and implemented by public institutions. So there is no parallel project unit. At the same time, oversight is ensured jointly by government and partners. And we have like external audit. We can have external audit on this type of aligned pool fund. So this is not simply aid channel through the system, and it's important. It's aid that strengthens the system itself. We focus on the system, not on the school we build and stuff like that. It improves the efficiency and traceability of external funding. And reinforce the execution of domestic resources. That's another point, very important. Since we're working with the national execution process, it's help for a fund, but also for the national fund, which are the majority, as you know. In short, Aligned Pool Fund act as a catalyst for stronger institution and more effective public spending. So we have few examples in countries like Burkina Faso, Madagascar, Burundi, Niger. And what we show since many years now, that it works actually. And it suggests that alignment can deliver both scale and results. I will take just a little bit more time on Niger. In 2018, in Niger, partners reestablished a sector-wide pool fund aligned with national procedure. We had 8 partners. We mobilized 130 million euros. Resources were fully integrated into sector priority. We had 5 ministries, so this was not only basic education, it was also tertiary education and other human development ministries. And implementation was decentralized. Despite security fragility, the fund operates nationwide. In Niger, there is many zones we cannot go, it's like insecure zone. But we're using local state human resources rather than parallel system delivery, and it works actually. Even after the 2023 coup d'etat we had in Niger, still this fund is going on and working. Niger demonstrates that aligned pool financing can sustain delivery systems while reinforcing institution capacity, even in very fragile environment like Niger. Just to conclude a little bit, what we see is that over the past 20 years is that alignment did not underperform because this principle was flawed. It underperformed because it was never fully implemented. The use of national systems remained limited, fragmentation increased, and donor incentive offer favored short-term control and risk avoidance. And I will stop like for 10 seconds on that. I just wanted to say that as a task team leader in the French development, in any development bank or the World Bank, we have no incentives on alignment. We have no incentives on institutional capacity building. I have a lot of incentives on gender. I have like a whole team working on gender in my institution. We will check if my project will do enough on gender. I have the same on climate. I have the same on many topics, but not on this one. And actually, and it's the same for the World Bank and for every institution. We don't have any incentives to do more on that, actually. But for us, from my side, it seems very important things to work. Alignment will not become the norm unless incentives change. on an international level, but also on the national one. And it's exactly on what we are working now with few colleagues. It's to identifying how national and international incentive structure can be redesigned so that the progressive use of national systems becomes the default rather than the exception. And what we believe is that this aligned pool fund can be, in some context, it can be a good solution. And we had few good example on that. So ultimately, sustainable impact depends less on the volume of aid than the architecture and the incentive through which it flows. And it's what we discussed. We tried to discuss it on the F54 in Seville. We try to give some input for the next G7 meetings, which will be in France. So it's something we would like to say. And we had few work on that, and especially one book on this aligned pool fund in 5 example countries. If you want to know a little bit more how it works in practice, or if you have any question, we can answer it. But we have some good publication on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Rehan. It's great to be reminded of the fact that we know these things and we know these principles. They've been around a long time, and actually we have a lot of very good experiences. And I really like that framing you had of moving from risk avoidance to risk management within national systems. I think that's a helpful way of thinking about it. But we've focused a lot in this session on mechanisms for using, transferring international ODA, international resources. And I mean, I think one of the other messages that came out very clearly this morning was the whole question of other sources of revenue, and particularly the critical role of domestic revenue generation. And our last speaker, Ali Abbas, who is the Deputy Director of the IMF Fiscal Affairs Department, where he supervises work on sovereign debt, governance, anti-corruption, and expenditure policy. And he's led key reforms to the fund's lending and crisis resolution frameworks, served as fund liaison to the Paris Club, and been closely involved in several exceptional access fund-supported programs, including in Argentina and Ukraine. And Ali's going to talk to us about examples of where there's been really positive examples of leveraging aid and ODA resources to enable greater revenue generation and domestic spending in conflict environments. So over to you, Ali. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and also for putting a picture of me from 25 years ago when I was an ODI fellow to Tanzania. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me just say that the views expressed in this presentation are my views and do not necessarily represent the views of the IMF, its management, or executive board. What I will do is a 3-part presentation in which give you some background on the fund's engagement in fragile and conflict states, then zoom in on 4 country cases where we are active, and then close with some considerations looking ahead. So the first part, we have a fragile and conflict state strategy that was approved in 2022 with 3 main principles. One was the fund should build on its comparative advantage, which is its knowledge and experience with macro stability, inclusive growth, and also institution building, catalyzing donor partner support. Also, the second principle, tailor IMF engagement to fragility and conflict context through the 3 arms of the fund's operations, which is surveillance, which is our regular review of countries' economies, capacity development, which the Fiscal Affairs Department is a big part of, and program design and conditionality, which is part of our lending operations. And then finally, leveraging development partners to amplify the IMF's impact, whether it's in the humanitarian space, in development, peace and security. So these are the principles, and against these, what we've seen over the last few years is important progress in three parts. 3 areas. The first is we have come up with these country engagement strategies. And over the last 2 years, 3 years, we've rolled out 20 CESs to identify drivers of fragility and conflict, constraints on reform and long-term macroeconomic policies to exit fragility. 5 of these CESs have been finalized last year, and another 5 are in advanced stages. The second is partnership with humanitarian and development organizations, of course, the World Bank, the MDBs, the UN system, but also we've partnered with the World Food Program to address food insecurity. Some IMF resources were channeled through the World Food Program to combat extreme hunger in South Sudan. Also, the World Food Program operationalized school feeding programs in Chad, where the IMF provided advice on how to accommodate the program within the budget. And the third one is expanded field presence. During 2022-2025, there were 6 additional resident representatives that were added, and 20 local economists, what we call long-term experts. 47 of these long-term experts have been deployed to 6 regional capacity development centers. So important progress in these 3 areas. This chart gives you a snapshot of the IMF's engagement with FCS economies. This is as of March 2025. We're updating the strategy. And you can see the top block, which is for 19 FCS, we are involved in surveillance, CD delivery, and programs. So all 3 arms. For about 11, it's surveillance and CD delivery. And then our engagement is constrained in 4 because of conflict. And so the red colors there are countries that are in conflict. And just to give you a sense of the importance of FCS, 1/5 of the fund's membership, which is about 190 members, are fragile and conflict states. They account for 1 billion of the world's population. And we have provided since 2020 $48.5 billion in financial assistance allocated to 25 FCS, whether in emergency or part of our regular programs. Now, this money doesn't go directly to, say, education or health. Fund money is general money provided to a country, but we do have floors on social protection spending, which helps ensure that a minimum level of social spend will be maintained. Just to focus a little bit on our CD capacity development efforts, where we go in and provide technical assistance and even train staff in country authorities. 3/5 of IMF CD to FCS is devoted to building domestic revenue mobilization and public financial management capacity. You can see the pie, and this is the blue part. 59% of the total CD that we provide is on these important fiscal areas. And there's another interesting fact, which on the left, which is that 26% of all IMF single country CD spending is dedicated to FCS in FY25 last year, and it's rising to 29% this year, which is a pretty substantial share of our total CD support. Briefly on case studies, Lebanon, there was a discussion of that. Here, we've been operating in an environment where there has been fiscal deterioration, collapse in public administration, stagnation of decision-making, paralysis really, and that has affected PFM functions. Major economic, political, and security challenges since 2019 have made CD delivery very difficult for us. In this context, our response has been to help the countries rebuild core tax and customs functions, including tax policy design and a phased digital transformation, support the resumption of core PFM functions by restoring fiscal reporting, medium-term projections. We've also increased training efforts in PFM topics in coordination with the Institute of Finance attached to the MOF. We've provided CD on personnel spending, which helped explain to line ministers why there was not the fiscal space to increase personnel spending. Now, the last column is on our partners. We have a multi-donor thematic fund, Global Public Finance Partnership. So rather than earlier when donors provided money for capacity development, it was, this is X million for Sudan, South Sudan, for PFM. Rather than that, we're moving to a global public finance partnership fund where the money is not earmarked or targeted. The money is provided to the fund, and then the fund allocates that money, and that sort of helps us be more flexible and agile in provision of CD. We also have a formal donor coordination group in place with the World Bank, EU, UNDP, and France. And interestingly, there was a joint IMF, World Bank, ILO workshop on pension spending, which improved the authorities' understanding of spending pressures there. Second case is Somalia, which is perhaps well-researched, and some successes there. When we got involved, there were huge issues with procurement to payment, delays in procurement to payments, and expenditure arrears, and the domestic revenue mobilization system was severely weakened and fragmented. Our response has been to re-engineer PFM processes through digital invoice tracking, and this has actually led to benefits I'll show you in the following slide. It's the only country, it's among now a very few SSA countries with fully paperless budget execution and fiscal reporting. And also, we've helped develop a sequenced DRM reform roadmap, and recently helped the authorities introduce a modern income tax law. Our partners are with a multi-donor thematic fund, Somalia Country Fund. There is work in collaboration with the World Bank, and the DRM CD is part funded by the EU. And these two charts show how Somalia has improved on its fiscal transparency, which is the left chart, and the right chart shows the reduction in the number of days to process and pay supplier invoices before the reform or before IMF intervention and after our intervention. Briefly on South Sudan, I'm running out of time, just one more minute. Again, a case of political instability, severe humanitarian crisis, with pipeline disruptions, IFMIS outage. We have worked there to help develop a macro fiscal framework, basic fiscal reporting, control over government resources, and we're happy that the publication of budget execution reports happened from 2022-23 onward. Here we are involved with the World Bank and AFDB, and also with the EU and Norway. And then finally, Syria, because it has come up a lot. I won't go into the problems, they're probably well understood, but where we are active is in developing realistic sequenced roadmap for DRM reform and rebuilding public trust. And then in-person missions we've conducted first in 14 years to support preparation of the 2026 budget and initiate the introduction of a treasury single account and a basic cash management function. And here, our CD is funded via multi-donor thematic fund, GPFP, and also MATAC. I'll just conclude with maybe one slide. We would like to see a realistic CD approach. This has come up a lot with strong donor coordination and CD funding. The chart on the right just sort of captures the 4 dimensions, which is country leadership, donors, the tailoring of CD to the country circumstances, and the building of domestic institutions. But on the left, there are 3 important points. The first is capacity building efforts need to take the authorities' absorptive capacity into account and target bite-sized improvements, not load a lot on the authorities to achieve sustained progress. International financial institutions can help coordinate donor support in DRM and PFM with the authorities in the lead, because CD is provided to the country and they need to be in the lead on that. And my last but important point is that as aid flows shrink, countries will need to rely more on domestic revenue mobilization and efficient management of resources to meet critical spending needs. So in that context, there is a need to strengthen CD funding to help sovereigns build DRM and PFM capacity. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Take us back to the sort of conversation we had this morning, which really sort of focused on the political nature of these questions. And I think that's important to hold in our minds. I was living in Nairobi last year when the closure of USAID was announced. I mean, this example, as I've heard it been widely discussed, but it was really striking being there. That the question immediately that emerged was the scale of the impact on the health delivery in the country, which was enormous, and which the population just hadn't understood and hadn't been communicated. And there was a moment of collective, I think, penny dropping of people saying, hold on, we pay all these taxes. We've been having this argument over tax levels in Nairobi over the last few years. And it turns out you're not even delivering half of the services that we thought you were. So it's a kind of flip side of the conversation we had this morning. So this question of revenue mobilization and the role of domestic actors and how that moves in track with service delivery, with communication around service delivery, they really go to the heart of the political questions. And they're in obviously a pretty stable environment, not what we usually think of when we're talking about fragile and conflict-affected settings. So we've heard a lot. We've covered a lot of ground, and we have one outstanding question from before. I think there was also somebody else I'll bring in a second. But I want to open it up. We have about 20 minutes for conversation and questions. So please feel free to come in, direct your questions wherever you wish. But I'll start with the lady who I wasn't able to bring in before.
Hi, thank you. I actually have two questions now. I'll be really quick. Sorry. So I'm Amy Whitehall. I work for the International Rescue Committee, IRC. So my original question for Abdulkader was, you were talking about operational flexibility, but I was just wondering if you experienced limitations on this because you were operating under an FCDO contract, which presumably had like milestones and targets that you had to hit in order to be paid. So that was the question for you. And then my second question, is for Rowan. And I was just thinking in practical terms about operationalizing the pooled funds that you were talking about. Have you experienced challenges in coordinating with other donors or disagreement between donors on visions for such pooled funds? Because we were talking a lot about how different projects in the same country that are funded by different donors often face, they often have different objectives, different rules, different requirements. So I wondered if that made it challenging to align between the donors themselves, especially in conflict contexts where donor engagement and financing is very politicized. And then how do you overcome this? Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a lot of hands. Let's start here and go this side, and then maybe we'll come back, and then I'll do this side.
Thank you, Mr. Ali, for. I have a question regarding what is the vehicle or the arm that the IMF uses to disperse or like contribute to capacity development or whatever contributions in fragility and resilience contest. The second question is that does the IMF have a framework for this? I think like having a framework established to help neutralize the politics or like make financing processes politically insulated. But as per what I know, like there is none at the moment. Maybe like we've seen only one coming out of ISDB, the Islamic Development Bank that I know of, but I don't know if there is this consensus, especially with the fragmentation of the financing landscape at the moment over the standards and norms on how to deal with fragility and resilience. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you.
My question is for Ali. Can you please elaborate a bit more on specific challenges in fragile states in regard to tax administration?
Thank you. And I had Eva at the back.
Thank you. I think my question touches on a few of the presentations. Rowan, you talked about aid being transformative when it goes through institutions, and I wondered if there's potential for plurality in that, because as per the Sudan context, the institutions are not necessarily working for the people. When you have a context of a predatory state, poor social contract, which is not just in Sudan, it's across Africa, and your Kenya example, Freddie, and aid capture, which is a very well-known thing. So just wondered about plurality and looking at mutual aid as an institution, actually, in a context like Sudan. And I wonder if fragmentation is sort of sector speak for too difficult, too complex, and too tricky to keep too many plates spinning. And what is the evidence that parallel financing of financing ecosystems, as Juliet put it, is negatively impacts outcomes? Is it actually about implementation difficulties and how do we resource, capacitate, and scale up, rather than really focusing on impact on the ground? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, let's start with those, and then I'll come back. Maybe we start with you, Ali, and then we'll work along.
Thank you. So there was a question of what are the arms through which the fund provides financial assistance. So our regular vehicle is the Extended Credit Facility, the ECF. But in order to, which we call UCT, Quality Upper Credit Tranche Quality Program. But in order to get to that, many fragile and conflict states often have to pass through a period of staff monitored programs, SMPs. And once capacity has been built up, data has been firmed up that we need for an upper credit tranche quality program, then we can provide financing through that vehicle. But even if a country does not have a program as a means for us to provide financial assistance, we can still provide CD to that country. And the resources for that come from donors, our own resources as well. So that's another way in which we can continue to support a country that is not in a fund program. There are two other windows which don't require a fund program for us to disburse money to countries. One is called the Catastrophe Containment Relief Trust, the CCRT, which if there is an external shock, a catastrophe, that countries that are at a high level of debt distress can get debt service waivers from the fund through that trust. And the other is the Rapid Credit Facility, which is a response to a shock like COVID. We dispersed a lot of money through this emergency facility. There was a question about whether the IMF has a framework. We do have this, the FCS strategy, which goes back to 2022. And so that's, in some sense, our guiding framework. On the question of politically difficult contexts, I would mention maybe the work stream that we have on governance, because this issue that was mentioned earlier, that you can have a situation where the state is predatory. How do you deal with that? Can you just disburse money to that state? So there, in those contexts, but in other contexts too, where governance and corruption are macro critical, then we do also provide support in terms of governance diagnostics, where we identify the main areas of governance and corruption vulnerabilities and the reforms needed to address them. And the final question that I got was on tax administration challenges in FCS. I'll mention two. One is informality, which is a particularly acute challenge in FCS contexts. And the traditional way in which we perhaps approach reforms, or reforms have been approached is around where the tax event occurs, and the outdated idea that businesses operate from fixed locations, which is not the case when you have very high informality. And the other is, when the tax event arises, reforms rely on declarative systems, people to declare, but actually the informal sector demands real-time taxation. So those are two challenges. But there's another one which is around organizational culture, that a lot of appointments and promotions in the tax administration are patronage driven, not merit driven. morale of staff is very low because of weak salaries and lack of performance systems. And there's often a disconnect between formal roles and informal actions. People are assigned to do a certain task, but that task is being performed by other people. And of course, the problem of political interference. So these have to be navigated in FCS context. Thanks.
Thanks very much. So we can turn to you, Rohan. I think there was one question explicitly for you, and maybe you can also come in on Eva's question around alignment to different kinds of institutions.
The first question was about coordination challenge in pool fund. It's an issue for sure. But just to explain a little bit how it works, in this aligned pool fund, at the beginning of the year, we have like meetings with all the funders of this fund, discussing together to fix the role, to fix the amount of fund we will have. And we even try to do it for 3 years when we can. So there is like coordination issue, but at the end, we have like a consensus and we send like a letter to the Ministry of Education. And the Ministry of Education, with this letter, we do the planification. And after that, we will see the planification and see what we could farm with a rule or not. So it's a part of the discussion, but at the end, it's done actually. It's in the finance law with a special code, and like that, it's a national execution. So coordination is an issue for sure, but in this type of fund, there's nothing. In DRC, with projects, the coordination is huge, and there's almost no coordination actually. In aligned pool fund, we have discussion. We can agree to disagree sometimes, but at least at the end, we have like a consensus. But just on this topic too, I would like to say that there is like institutional incentives too, actually. So we work with European Union, Switzerland, Luxembourg, even Canada and many others, but it was almost impossible to work with some others, actually. I won't name them, but for some others, they don't want to be part of it. For them, alignment is not an issue, or they are okay to be aligned, but with them. That's the point often. So this issue of incentives is very important. And on Sudan, I don't know Sudan, so I don't know if in this country we could do that. What can I say is that in many developing countries there is no issues like that, but still 80% of the international aid is with projects. I mean, in Senegal, in Ivory Coast, we are funding schools since maybe like 20 or 30 years, but with project only. We never did it with the Ministry of Finance, with the Ministry of Education, with national procedure. It's a shame in a way. So in many countries, we definitely have to think a little bit on this way, on this alignment and pooling fund and having this institutional construction capacity building and stuff like that. But in some other countries like this, like Sudan, I don't know, probably not. But what I would say that it's maybe the exception. In many other countries, still we could work like that, but it's not working right now. And just like on the impact issue, it's huge in my institution, and we have like impact bonds. So and many other tools work on impact. I have nothing against impact, but often it's only short-term impact. And you know that on education, it's most often it's long-term. There is multiple way of seeing impact, and sometimes focusing only impact. It's a way to do project, and if you want to have a real impact and to know what if you want to sell impact, you will do a project at the end. And if you want to do institutional capacity building, it will take time. And just having this impact view can be like a bit difficult, in my opinion.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you to hold any responses. So we have one more round with the audience, and then we'll pick up at the end. So I've got, a few. Maybe we start in the middle here, and then we'll work in that direction.
Thank you. So I got 3 questions that I, as a caveat, I'm gonna present in a bit of a dichotomy way, just to push for the reflection. We were told, we listened this morning to how, on education projects, for example, the Cox's Bazar example, where the best is to work with, spontaneous community systems. And then this afternoon, we're being told that the money best spent is the money spent on reinforcing institutions. So, I mean, I know that there's that it's not completely opposite, but I would like to hear the experts maybe on when to do what, just so that we have sort of a clearer line. In line with this, we've also heard about aligned pool funding, and so I wanna ask, because outside this room, there's also a lot of discussion about area-based approaches and area-based coordination. So how do these two patterns, these two streams, coordinate? And talking about conditionalities and the caveats that you were putting, Juliet, that how they need to be participatory and equitable, etc. But aren't we feeding the beast in the sense of, we've also mentioned risk aversion, how we are not really moving towards risk management. So adding like benchmarks in the middle of a process, I can see the benefits, okay? But my fear, my sort of gut reaction is that we are just giving another opportunity for conditionalities and risk aversion to act as a dam for funds. And so, sort of achieving the opposite objective. Over.
Thank you.
Yes, hi. No, thank you so much. And I just wanted to thank all the panelists and Rohan, especially on the point on alignment, which I think I wanted to not ask on, but just contribute to, drawing on Sudan and also coming back to Eva's point on predatory states. So the 2 points I just wanted to make on research we've had done on resilience of health systems in Sudan and fragile settings and looking at diaspora contributions is to validate the point on alignment. So in our study, diaspora worked both with mutual aid groups, the different groups of diaspora that we examined, but also a key finding was national alignment with Ministry of Health supported immediately absorptive capacities in terms of, the rapid responses that were needed in Khartoum state and then also in Jazeera, but then also were key for recovery stage, where aid conditionalities meant that, donors were not going to fund reconstruction of hospitals. And so national health systems had to turn to diaspora and leverage non-traditional aid so they can then draw onto that source and then rebuild and reconstruct institutional systems. So I also just wanted to caution towards the analytical confusion between regimes and state institutions. And I think whenever we confuse that, we risk that political narratives then leave donors maybe assumptive of not working with national health systems. And that was something we also observed in our study, coming as well in voice from diaspora. So not just voice from government actors, but voice from diaspora. And I think this just need to be analytically precise in that aspect. So probably just to add my voice on the importance of alignment and how it reinforced strengthening health systems in the Sudan case study, but happy to speak individually with evidence.
Thanks very much. So I think at the back we had Cahill and then one in the corner.
Thanks. Cahill from ODI. I'd like to probe a little bit on the pooled funds for education. You mentioned kind of getting donors aligned around the roles. What type of spending do they align around? And specifically, do they fund teacher salaries, and to what extent is that a sticking point within the consortiums? Thanks.
Thanks. I just wanted to also stick with the pooled funds question for Rohan and just ask if you could clarify. You've mentioned that we've been having these conversations since Paris in 2005, but if I'm not wrong, even before that, we were having conversations that led to the development of these so-called sector-wide approaches. swaps, which sound pretty similar to what you described, even in the 1990s. I remember in Ghana and other places that I was, there had been these attempts. And so I was wondering if you could just clarify, if you have a view, is there a difference between what you've described and these swaps? And either way, what is your view on why we might have hit upon a solution like that along 30 years ago, and it hasn't, as you showed, we haven't made much progress since then? So what is is there more to say about the politics of why that has happened that you think we can address somehow? You've talked about incentives, but I guess, at a global level, the incentives remain challenging.
Olia, you can have 30 seconds because I want to come back to the panel.
Just a quick clarification on Cox's Bazar. There was a question right there. To remind you, we could not coordinate with the government in Cox's Bazar. Therefore, some of the solutions that were brought here were not an option. And in that case, we need to prioritize community solutions. And similarly in Sudan, that route was not available. So if that route is not available, then, ideally we would have multi-pronged approach. It wouldn't be all or nothing. It would be like an ecosystem of solutions. Hope that clarifies a little bit. Thank you.
Okay, no, thank you very much. So I want to give an opportunity, we have a couple of minutes, so please keep responses. There's a lot that you can draw and pick up on. I also just remind us of the question from earlier around the role of intermediaries and whether it's really kind of desirable going forwards. Maybe we'll start with you, Juliet, and work along for any kind of final thoughts or reflections.
Yes, sure. 1 minute each. So the question on mutual aid, yes, you can fund mutual aid initiatives directly, really with your own money. What's hard is then using institutional money from any form of institution to fund mutual aid groups. I remember in the Ukraine response, the challenges that humanitarian directors and NGOs had trying to get around their own finance directors and internal auditors in order to be able to finance volunteer groups. And it was really, really difficult, let alone institutional money at scale. So when you're talking about institutional money, that's where intermediaries become really important because they can help manage those mechanisms. And in our paper, we highlight 2 examples. One is where international intermediaries can have been and continue to be and could in the future be extremely useful and important and valuable in being those intermediaries, or else working directly with networks of mutual aid groups like the ERRs, for example. But it's early days for that. So there's a lot of learning to be done. I think the Resilio Fund is really interesting, where it's bringing together mainly philanthropy money, and they are being extremely careful about trying to inform themselves, explore and protect the principles behind mutual aid in the way that they speak and express, as well as the way that they're acting in order to try and do it responsibly. And mutual aid as an institution, I'll have to think about that, but it doesn't sit very comfortably, I have to say.
Yeah, so I will answer Amy's question really quickly about operational flexibility as an enabler, but also it could be a limitation in terms of like having a contract with the donor. And of course, like contract itself is mainly focused on impact, outcome level. Of course, it states the outputs and the activities, but there is some flexibility in, for example, revisiting work plans, revisiting annual work plans, for example. Of course, this kind of flexibility will require proper approvals. So this is definitely a limitation. And of course, sometimes like we'll need like more time, for example, to visit milestones or even revisit KPIs, specifically with a big change in context, like what happened in Syria. But for example, this did not stop us. This is the part where another enabler is we take a risk and we say, we want to follow this approach and revisit the contract, even if that means that if we don't achieve a KPI, it might cause us a loss. So the contract itself does not drive profit, but actually drive what needs to be achieved. And specifically with when we're talking about timeliness of the contract, because this is the part back to Olia's points earlier in her session, that we need to make sure that we build in something within the contract, because the contract is limited and the project will end, we need to make sure that there are plans in terms of sustainability so that it could include capacity building, or if we're working with like institutions, to make sure that there is technical assistance available to build that capacity so they can carry that forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Rehan.
Yes, very quickly. On this issue on community funding, and I would like to, it's probably something very interesting to study. I'm a bit afraid that at the end it will become a project. And on education, we have to work with the state, since the teachers will, if not, it will be privatization actually. And it's another issue. We didn't discuss so much about it, but it's a major issue in many countries. If we don't want with the state, it will mean privatization in many ways. So, and for a developing bank like us, we want to work with the state. So it's the main, that's the entry on the topic. So, yeah, yes, I will. So we'll see. On area-based coordinate funding, it's a little bit the same. And I would like to say that on aligned pool fund, we worked a lot on decentralization, and it's something very, very important. One of the major issues in many countries is that the execution rate is very low because it's centralized. And if you ask the Ministry of Education in Kinshasa to build school in Goma, it will be almost impossible. It will be very long. So there is an issue on decentralization. And in Niger, 80% of the total amount of the aligned pool fund was on decentralized institution, which mean like schools and some state decentralized institution. So it's something very important for us. On the type of activities we are funding, in TREF, we are funding the teacher salary. So it's, yeah, sometimes we can do it. On many other aligned pool fund, we are investing more in building, in training of teachers and stuff like that. It depends. It can be discussed, but there is no there's no religion on that, actually. We could fund what we want. And maybe on the question you had, why is it not working? Why are we still there, like 20 or maybe 50 years after all the questions? In my opinion, but it's part of the discussion we have together with some colleagues and on the research we are working on. I would like, aid is about development for sure, but it's also about influence. And the institutions who want influence don't like so much alignment. They don't like so much pool fund because they will lose a little bit the little power they have on the funding. So it's all about this trade-off between development and influence. So in a way, we have to find a way to give some good incentives. And one is, it's probably about the data. We don't know who are aligned, who are not. We don't know the country, the sector who are aligned or not. There is no data on it, actually. And it's something we are working on. So there's no incentives. I told you there's many incentives on gender, on climate. I'm very happy about it. But we don't have any issue. We don't have any data on alignment, on institution construction. So maybe we could start on that. I mean, having data and having incentives within institutions like the World Bank or mine. Yep, sorry.
Maybe just a last quick word on, for us, the first best is clearly to build the state's capacity to deliver core services like primary education, basic healthcare, social protection. And so we will continue as a capacity development provider, as a lender, to build that state capacity, because for us, that is first best. But, you know, to the extent that the state cannot achieve the level of capacity where it can deliver those services, there is a gap. And clearly, education cannot wait. Kids cannot be left not going to school. And so in that space, there is a role for other types of channels that were mentioned, but it's important to have some controls around that. Otherwise, you can sometimes create a bigger problem later on because there was not enough regulation or quality control around those other mechanisms. So those, that's one thought here. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And let's just take a moment to say thank you to wrap us up, and I also have an opportunity to come back with some reflections after the next session. But maybe, I mean, I think you've really brought us to a great point at the end there. It's this managing this tension between, and I think there's something in thinking, complexifying our thinking about institutions. I think we tend to hear institutions and we think about government ministries. Institutions are complex and myriad by nature. And I think if we can think more creatively and thoughtfully about how we understand institutional landscapes in different settings and then adapt to them, I think there's something in that to really help the thinking. But thank you very much. And over to Olia, I think, who's moderating. Well, there's a break, but Olia will be picking up after the break at 3:45. 3:45? So 25 minutes for coffee break.